Welcome everyone to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF, and Hebrew name is Bitronistim. IDSF is a leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. Today is a very big day in Israel as we find ourselves many times in this war, glued to the news, watching now the return of the hostages who are coming home today after months and months and months in Hamas captivity. And then what is now going to happen is the return of terrorists by Israel to Gaza and other areas. And joining me today to discuss this, to analyze it, to explain to us what is going on is Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, who is very much an expert on these issues. Maurice, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me again.
So why don't we just jump in, Maurice? Why don't you share your reactions to what is right now transpiring in the news, both the return of the hostages and as a result of this deal, the return of terrorists leaving Israeli prison system?
So it is without question a fabulous day to see the release of at least some of the hostages from the grips of these genocidal Gazan terrorists. But it's also a day which is mixed with very, very difficult feelings. We're seeing really mass murderers being released as part of this deal. Some of them, maybe if I can, I'll just give a general overview of what's happening as part of this initial deal. What was agreed as part of this deal was that Israel would release 736 terrorists, and that have already been convicted or are in prison and standing trial, in addition to another 1,167 other terrorists who were arrested in Gaza during the operations on the ground. Of the terrorists being released, there was a specific scale set, how many terrorists and of what nature would be released in return for every single different type of hostage being released. So there was a lesser price to pay, a high price nonetheless, for civilians being released, and then a higher price to pay for soldiers being released, specifically the Tatzpitaniot, the girls from Nahal Oz, and so the overall picture that we see is that of the 736 terrorists being released, there are also going to be, at least if Hamas follows through on the deal, some 250 terrorists being released who are all serving life sentences. Now, when the Israeli government published this to the public, and when most people talk about these terrorists being released, it's a terrorist serving a life sentence. It doesn't really necessarily mean anything until you understand a few of these names. Who are they? What did they do? Why are they in prison? Are they serving just one life sentence or potentially multiple life sentences? And that's really when we get into the details, we see some of the really tremendous complications and really the very complicated nature of this deal in and of itself. Take today, for example, right? Today we're seeing the release of potentially 8 hostages, 3 Israelis and 5 Thailandese. And in return, we're releasing another group of terrorists. One of the terrorists being released today is a terrorist called Muhammad Abu Warda. Now, I understand that almost nobody will know who Muhammad Abu Warda is, what he did. When it was published, the details for the public, it says Muhammad Abu Warda, he's been in jail since 1996, serving a life sentence, and you don't really get much more details than that. So here's Muhammad Abu Warda that was released today. Muhammad Abu Warda, together with his partner in crime, Hassan Salameh, was responsible for the series of bus bombings in Jerusalem in 1996. Muhammad Abu Warda isn't serving one life sentence, but rather he's serving 48 consecutive life sentences for the 44 people that he actually murdered, and for the other attempted suicide attacks, from which thankfully only people were only, as I say, in inverted commas, were only injured. So we're talking about really a mass murderer who is being released. We have previous examples of this that can also be and should be named. And And here is an additional complication. As part of the deal, it was agreed that some of these terrorists being released would be deported abroad, some permanently, some temporarily. Some would be deported to Gaza. Some would be released back to Judea and Samaria, where they came from originally. And some would be released, specifically Israeli Arab terrorists, would be released back to Jerusalem. So let's just give an example of two of those people. You have Majdi Zaatri. Majdi Zaatri is a Jerusalem resident. He was responsible for planning and carrying out a suicide bombing on bus number 2 in Jerusalem in August 2003, and which resulted in the murder of 23 people. Majdi Zaatri is being released back to Jerusalem, which, let's put this in context. This mass murderer can now go back to the scene of the crime, take a TikTok video. Here I'm back at the scene of the crime where I murdered all of these Zionists. It was a bus of Haredim. It was the attack was in a Haredi neighborhood, and included the murder of 8 children. And say, I'm back here, I'm free. The Zionists are still dead, and we can do nothing about it. Another one, Fahmy Mashara. Fahmy and his brother Ramadan Mashara planned and executed the suicide bombing on bus number 19 in Jerusalem as well, 19A in Jerusalem, murdering 19 people. Fahmy Mashara, similar to Majdi Zaatri, is a Jerusalem resident, and he's going back to Jerusalem. So we really do have this complex situation where we have mass murderers returning to the scenes of their crime. The Israeli residents also have free access to go anywhere around the country. They can do whatever they want, go wherever they want, and again, be involved in terrorism. And that's part of the complexities. An additional part of the complexities of this deal was that, if you remember, in 2011, there was the deal to free Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who had been kidnapped in 2006 and was held by Hamas. As part of that deal, the terrorists were given a conditional release. What does that mean, a conditional release? They were released on the condition that they didn't go back to terrorism. If they returned to terrorism, they could then be rearrested and sent back to serve their original sentences. I had a personal experience with this in 2014. If you remember, with the kidnapping and murder of the 3 teens in Gush Etzion, on that, they were kidnapped and murdered on Thursday night. On Sunday morning, I initiated the rearrest of dozens of these Hamas terrorists who had been released in the Shalit deal, and we saw 70 terrorists going back to jail simply because they had been involved in other terrorism and were now being sent back, some of them for life sentences. Many of those people that I returned to prison in 2014 were on the top list of Hamas to be released now, right? So part of the 436 are 47 of these terrorists who were released from life sentences, returned to terrorism, were rearrested, and now they're going free again. As part of this deal, Israel, I would say, I'm not often full of criticism for these types of events, but here is a word of criticism nonetheless. Israel, as part of this deal, agreed to waive that conditional release. That means the terrorists who have been released now, who, if they tomorrow go back to terrorism, can't be returned for their original sentences. It's like the whole deal then was equivalent to, I assume that people will be more familiar with the idea of parole. You're released on parole. You get an early release from prison, but if you go back to crime, then you go back to prison and you finish your sentence. So that we even gave up on. So now we have these swaths of terrorists, some of them mass murderers, going back to Gaza, going back into Israel, going back into Judea and Samaria, some albeit being sent abroad. And what we've seen in the past, to give a little bit of context, the Palestinians celebrate 48 different instances in which Israel has released prisoners for whatever reason it may be, whether it be to free the soldiers who were captured in Lebanon during the Lebanon War, 1983-84. That led to the Jibril deal in 1985, where we released 1,150 terrorists. And then over time, we saw the Oslo Accords release of thousands of terrorists, many of whom had also been convicted and sentenced to life sentences for murder, going back onto the streets. Now, what we saw every time after one of these mass releases was another wave of terrorism. 1985 was the release. 2 years later, we start with the Intifada, with the release of the terrorists as part of the Oslo Accords. 2000, September 2000, a massive terror campaign. And every time we release terrorists, they go back to terrorism. As part of the discussion prior to approving this latest deal in the cabinet, the head of the Shabak actually gave an incredible statistic. Now, I, as the previous head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria, we'd seen these terrorists going out, we'd seen them coming back. I tried in my position as the prosecution to keep a record, to see how many terrorists actually went back to terrorism. The statistic that I had over that short period of time from 2013 to 2016 was that there were at least 50% of the terrorists released in the Shalit deal went back to terrorism. Now, I only saw a very limited part of the picture because I didn't see or include what was going on with the terrorists in Gaza, like Yahya Sinwar, like all of the other terrorists, like Abdel Qadi Radwan, all of these other terrorists who were involved in terrorism in the Gaza Strip, but we weren't able to get to them. So what the head of the Shabak said is that according to the statistics that the Shabak had managed to gather, not only based on who actually went back to prison and was prosecuted, was that 82% of the terrorists released in the Shalit deal went back to terrorism. That means out of the 1,027 terrorists, we're talking about 850 or so who went back to terrorism. That's an incredible statistic. And so if we look at the past and see what we did, how did it result in another wave of terrorism, and then apply that now to what we think or fear is going to happen, I think that the first day of the ceasefire and the start of the terrorist release, the 19th of January, won't only be the day that we possibly ended the war in Gaza and started on this process of freeing the hostages, but will also start the countdown, unfortunately, and I don't say this lightly, to the next massacre. We don't know now to say, even at this stage, what was the price of the Shalit deal? You can say that the price initially was the release of 1,027 terrorists. The actual price that we've paid was dozens of people who were murdered in the period between 2011 until the massacre, and then another 1,200 people murdered in the massacre, and the soldiers that came after that. So we're really seeing the price of the Shalit deal was the murder of over 2,000 people. So when you then weigh that and say, well, was it the right decision to make? Is this something that we're going into with our eyes wide open to say, well, what are we expecting is going to happen? So I think it's famously attributed to Einstein, the idea that if you do the definition of insanity being that if you do the same thing over and over again in the same circumstances and without any changes, and then expect a different result, that's just insanity. So what we can, I think, unfortunately, legitimately expect as a result of this deal and the release of terrorists is another wave of terrorism that will start sooner or later and will again claim the lives of thousands of potential victims And that's only at the point, we're only at the starting point. Let's not forget that. The deal was for the release of these terrorists to secure the release of 33 of the 97 hostages that were still being held in Gaza. So we're still left with another 64 hostages at the end of this deal. And the price that Hamas is going to demand for the release of those hostages is only going to go up. And eventually we'll come to the understanding that there's no price that we can pay that will be sufficient in order to placate these genocidal terrorists. And we'll be stuck in the same situation where we have, I don't know, maybe we'll get, please God, to the point where we have only a small number of hostages, but those hostages will be used by Hamas in order to attack Israel for years, I fear, possibly even decades to come, if we don't fundamentally change the manner in which we deal with these terrorists.
Maurice, this is a very sobering conversation. Thank you for sharing all of this. Let me ask you a question. The state of Israel on the books does have a legal penalty called capital punishment. It's only been employed twice in our history, the last time being, of course, Eichmann in the 60s. A person like Abu Varda, who murdered 44 in Jerusalem, he has 48 life sentences. Why did he not have a death sentence? What is the state of the death penalty here in Israel? And can that be some sort of a solution moving forward so that if and when Israel has to enter into these deals, those terrorists just aren't alive anymore?
So I think if anyone were to do a Google search with my name together with capital punishment and the death sentence, they'll find that I am really a staunch proponent of the death sentence. I believe that Israel should use the death sentence more for these terrorists. But to explain also the complexities. There are a number of different subjects which are related to the death sentence which need to be examined. One, I wrote an article for the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Security and Foreign Affairs on the subject of detention, prosecuting, and punishing the terrorists who participated in the massacre. One of the chapters that I included there was a discussion of the death sentence. And what I explained there is the following. Israel, as you quite rightly said, has only implemented the death sentence twice. The most famous being Adolf Eichmann. I don't think there was any type of real discussion whether Adolf Eichmann was deserving of the death sentence, and that went forward. What people less know was that the first case was an officer in the army called Yusuf Tubiansky, who was suspected of, during the War of Independence, suspected of collaborating with the enemy, passing over intelligence information. He was brought before a court-martial and convicted and sentenced to death, and the death penalty was carried out. He was later exonerated of all charges. And so alongside the agreement that the death penalty is something which is worthy for the worst of criminals, we got to a stage here where we've now executed an innocent man. That, I argue, has caused Israel to suffer from really institutional and national trauma all the way through since then. This fear of possibly executing someone who would later be found to be innocent is something which really is a tremendous fear within the entire system. And so that's the national trauma that we suffer from. Now, paradoxically, as opposed to, I think, the general assumption regarding the religious parties in Israel that are often considered to be more extremist, it's actually the religious parties that have been the obstacle to implementing the death sentence. Why do I say that? It's based in Jewish law. In Jewish law, only a Sanhedrin can issue the death sentence. Only a Sanhedrin properly constituted has that authority. In modern day Israel, we don't have a Sanhedrin, and therefore you cannot get to a situation where you have the death sentence. So they have been often, the national religious parties, the Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, have been a traditional obstacle all the way along to implementing and moving forward with the death sentence. It's something which really does carry us along all the way through that intertwining environment and culture of where does Jewish law start and finish? Where does the state start and finish? To what extent does Jewish law have an influence on the laws of the country? And I can tell you just as an anecdote, there are some laws in Israel which are fundamentally based on halacha. And so we do have that influence coming in. The third question, which is really a moral value question, does Israel want to be included in the small group of countries in the world that have the death sentence? Most of the, I would say, the Western liberal societies don't have the death sentence, with the exception, obviously, of the United States. And there's been really a worldwide movement for a very long time to really contract the use of the death sentence. And it's something which really did get a lot of traction. And so the discussion was, at least prior to the October 7 massacre, you would have found that the discussion on the death sentence was more moving towards amending the legislation that exists that includes a provision for the death sentence and getting rid of that, seeing as that A, had almost never been used anyway, and B, do we want to be that type of a country? So really the idea was that we would move away from that. I think that that discussion has much calmed down. In Israeli civilian law, there is the death sentence as well. There are certain crimes within the criminal justice law that provides for the death sentence. Articles, for example, like Article 99 of the Criminal Code, which provides for the death sentence for anyone who helps the enemy during war. But then there's a stipulation, and the stipulation is that the death penalty can only be imposed if the crime was committed during a period when Israel was at war. So for the October 7 massacre, for example, I would believe, and so I've been pushing, that those terrorists who participated in the massacre should be subject to the death sentence without even the need to change Israeli law. It's a provision that already exists and just needs to be implemented. Now, the last obstacle, or one of the last obstacles that is broken down into two parts, is really the legal system in Israel. On the one hand, the judiciary, and on the other hand, the prosecution. I would say that I was probably one of the exceptions to the rule in the prosecution that would be willing to request the death sentence. I think most of the Israeli legal profession is going towards so-called enlightenment and moving away from these harsh punishments. And so not all of the prosecutors would be even willing to ask for the death sentence. And there's already case law which says that if the prosecution doesn't ask for the death sentence, then the courts can't impose it. So the prosecution is an obstacle in and of itself. And then you have the judiciary, the judges themselves. And if you have a judge that fundamentally disagrees with capital punishment, with the death sentence, then he won't award it. So getting over those hurdles is also something which is not even a question or a function of the law, not even a question of the right approach or the policy approach, but rather getting over the obstacles, the personal obstacles of the people in the system that aren't necessarily proponents of the death sentence.
Thank you, Maurice. You know, when you think about the death sentence, obviously it could have a number of different purposes, one of which would be to deter terrorism. Whether it deters a terrorist who is willing to die anyway is an interesting question. But I want to ask you a separate question. Again, we're looking at the staggering numbers, you know, how many terrorists are released per Israeli hostage. So let's say you are tremendously successful, and we hope that you are, and Israel in fact does institute a death penalty for these horrible terrorists. I would highly doubt that we're going to see Israel executing dozens and dozens of terrorists, such that we'd still have this dilemma of this high volume of terrorists being available to be given back. So, if the death penalty is instituted, would it have success in deterring these types of prisoner swaps?
So that's exactly, Moshe. It's as if you read my article before we came on. That's exactly one of the points that I touched on. Let's assume that we can get to this point where we activate the law, we prosecute the terrorists, we persuade the prosecutors and the judges to hand down the death sentence. We now have potentially, from the massacre itself, from the terrorists who were caught at the scene of the massacre and thereafter that participated, if you remember, there were a number of videos put out by the Israeli security forces of these terrorists confessing to their crimes. A terrorist who he and his father raped and murdered some of the victims. We now have potentially hundreds of these people, and so we have potentially a situation where we'll have hundreds of people of these terrorists on death row. To what extent will the Israeli public be able to withstand those scenes? To what extent would the international community be willing to allow Israel to do what is just and right and moral and to put these people to death? And so there also we would see, I believe, not a small amount of international pressure against Israel. You may be right, but it's not the way to go. It's what they're saying now. Well, it doesn't matter what happened on the 7th of October. The destruction in Gaza is so extensive and it wasn't warranted. Well, that's just not true. The destruction in Gaza is a function of the terrorists embedding themselves within the civilian population. And it was entirely warranted in order to, kill all of these terrorists, or as many of them as we could, and to neutralize the rest by arresting them and then putting them on trial and hopefully getting to the death sentence. So it is a subject of great concern, and it would be a question when we come up: who gets the death sentence? Is it someone who just raped and murdered? I don't mean to in any way make light of that. Just raped and murdered one person, or do we need someone who murdered an entire family? Where do we draw the line on that participation and who's worthy of the death sentence, yes or no? I would again advocate that anyone who participated in the October 7 massacre should be subject to the death penalty. These people invaded Israel from a different territory and massacred people, raped, murdered, tortured, beheaded. And I believe that the only fitting punishment for them is the death sentence. They have shown by their actions that they've lost what's called in Hebrew tselem enosh, this image of a human being. And when you can go out and murder babies and decapitate them and rape and murder wantonly, you've lost that basic image of being a human being. And therefore the just punishment, I think, is death.
Maurice Hirsch, thank you for all that you have done to prosecute these terrorists. Thank you for all you are currently doing to push harsher penalties, and thank you for sharing all of that with our viewers today. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.